Hey everyone, welcome back to another learning session. So today we are going to be starting off with the introduction to spreads. So we do have a number of presentations and videos on spreads here that dive in deeper to some of the topics that we go through today. And the reason we split it up is there are some spreads that we wanted to hone in a lot more for the farmer and rancher because of what their importance is going to be in their risk management plan. And we felt that diving into them deeper would be worthwhile in some other videos. But this one, we want to get everyone introduced to spreads. So we're going to go through what the different types of spreads are and what they tell us about the market. Let's get in here. Okay, so what are spreads? So agricultural commodity markets, a spread is the difference between two related commodities or two future contract periods. So spreads are one of the more powerful tools for reading market signals. They give you a lot of insight about supply, demand, arbitrage dynamics, something that you will not get from just a basic futures price of moving up and down. So there's four spreads that we want to get into here. So you have your intercommodity, which is two different but related commodities. If you've ever heard of the corn wheat spread, that would be one. Then we also have the intra-commodity, which is your calendar spreads that many of you are probably more familiar with. So that's where you have the same commodity but different contract periods. So think about your December-March corn spread. Then there's also the commodity product spread. So this one you've probably heard spoken about as well and under different names or names specific to crush spread. So it's your raw input and your finished goods from processing. So think about your crush spread for ag or in energy if you've heard the crack spread. The last one here is the inter-exchange. So it's the same commodity, but that's traded on two different exchanges. So if you think about ice versus Euronext canola. And generally on these ones, they are exchanges from different countries, different continents, that sort of thing. So we'll go through the calendar spreads here. So calendar spreads are arguably the most important spread type for a farmer to be following. They measure the difference between two contract months of the same commodity, which is calculated as your nearby minus your deferred. So why these calendar spreads matter is it's the difference between that nearby and deferred futures price that gives such an insight into physical market conditions. And it tells you a lot about what the market is also saying or believes should be happening in regards to storage costs, where the supply and demand situation is. Something that when you look at just whether a futures price for a commodity of a specific month is up or down, you're going to get that information. So we can use this to make some smarter storage and selling decisions. So as you can see our example here, we've got our December corn, which is the nearby, and our March corn, which is the deferred. And so it's always the nearby minus the deferred. So the D-Smart spread is negative 15 cents, which is also known as a 15-cent carry. So how do we read calendar spreads, right? So the nearby contract is going to always be your reference and you're subtracting the deferred from it. So you can get a negative and positive, and we'll go through what the difference is on each of those ones. So in a negative spread, so that's what we had, our D's versus a March is negative 15 cent. That is so that is saying the deferred is priced higher and the market is willing to pay you an additional 15 cents to carry product from December all the way to March in this situation, right? Signaling really ample nearby supply. On the other side, you can have an inverse, which is where the spread is positive. So that's where December, your nearby is priced higher than your deferred. So in this one, we did December at 465, less your March at 450, right? So that's a plus 15 cent, which is a 15 cent inverse. So what this is the market is incentivizing someone to sell their grain in the nearby right now rather than hold it because the market is demanding it right now, for whatever reason. Could it be Logistics issue, a supply tightness, just strong demand, anything like that. But what we really want to think about as some takeaways on this is a strong carry is a market paying you to store your grain. That is them saying essentially supply and demand is relatively well balanced, that we are not needing all of your product right now, but we will need it later on. And this is the additional value that you can get from carrying it for that time period to offset interest payments, for you carrying inventory, the cost of storage, etc. Whereas the inverse is signaling an incentive to sell your product right now rather than hold. As I mentioned, because the demand is so strong, supply is tight. It's basically saying the market is sell it right now for this better price. So next is your intercommodity spread. So these are also called your cross-commodity spread. So they're measuring the relative price difference between two different but economically related commodities. So the goal is to identify when essentially one substitute has become cheaper or more expensive than another. So really the classical one, as I mentioned, is that wheat-corn spread. So because wheat and corn can compete as feed grains, livestock feeders or any kind of buyer, they're always going to look for the cheapest option, source of energy or protein. So tracking this spread reveals some substitution pressure that can exist in real time. So when you think about it, in ag, protein content really drives a lot of the demand. So wheat generally carries a more protein per bushel than corn, which is why it has a price premium to it. But when that premium gets too wide, buyers will shift over to corn. And so that's why following the wheat-corn spread can be very important to see if there's demand changes, if prices are getting too expensive or too cheap on one side or one leg of that spread. So when the spread moves too far from historical norms as we have here, market forces are going to push it back. So the demand is going to move over to the cheaper commodity, which in turn will push up prices, right? The expensive one should fall because demand's coming off, all until you consider that a market equilibrium that becomes restored. So how do we read these? So with the cross commodity, the reference commodity is in the numerator, right? As a ratio or price difference. So the result generally you have to look at is being compared against long-term historical averages or long-term historical trading ranges on it. So if we look at our example, we have wheat at $6.10 a bushel, right? So it's got its premium over corn, and corn at $4.50. So what is that spread? So we take the wheat divided by corn to get a 1.36. Now, if we go back and we look and we say the historical average has been 1.15 on the spread. So what does that mean? That means that the wheat being divided by the corn, wheat is relatively overpriced right now to what we have historically seen against corn. So when that spread is above, what we would consider normal, the market has to respond, the way it should. If there's really no economic reason at that time for why that spread is outside of the norm. So what happens is buyers will step in and they will buy the substitute product, which is the cheaper corn over the wheat. So in that situation, you see wheat demand falls, which will generally mean the price of wheat declines. Corn demand will pick up, which means the corn price will rise. What happens is wheat is pressured down in price, corn is pressured up, and that spread gets narrowed back to this 1.15. So this is essentially that self-correcting dynamic that makes following these cross-commodity spreads a really good, reliable signal for price direction on related commodities and on substitute commodities. So then the third one we have is our commodity product spread. So as I mentioned, this a lot of you are familiar with what would be called the crush spread. So it's a relationship between raw inputs and the finished products derived from processing. So because the processing produces multiple outputs, these spreads will often have more than just the two legs to it. So in a crush spread, you have your input, which would be your soybeans, the raw commodity you're crushing. You then have your two outputs, which is soybean meal and soybean oil. So if you've heard the crush spread, you've also probably heard it referred to as a board crush, which is one of the most widely followed commodity product spreads in agriculture. It really reflects, as we have, the profitability of processing soybeans at any given moment, as it shoots out what the margin is for operating that. And again, it's something to be able to track to see what the demand and how the health is on that side of the industry. Trying to switch pages here. Okay, so how do we read this one with the multiple legs? So all of the components really have to be evaluated together as a single margin. You can't just go in and look at, is our soybean prices up when you're looking at a crush spread? You need to look at it, the soybeans, the meal, and the oil, and what that margin is showing you to get the full story about what's happening. So the soy crush margin, it combines the value of the soybean meal and oil produced per bushel and subtracts the cost of the raw soybeans, right? So all three legs move relatively independent, but they're all tracking to the combined margin of is what really matters, right? So when we say that they're moving independently, they have dependence on one another. As you can see, there's always going to be strong correlation, but it's never necessarily a one-to-one, because you have some other type of markets that include import and exports that can adjust the S&Ds. So if we just look at a crush margin and say it's $2 per bushel, this means that each bushel of soybeans is currently generating $2 in gross margin before costs. And these are all found easily online, and they're always discussed online about how crush margins are doing and how healthy that is based off of the demand of what their outputs are, which is the meal and the oil. So if we look at a $2 per bushel margin, it can tell us a fair amount just by looking at it. If you're making $2 a bushel, that's pretty lucrative, and that's a good margin right off the bat, right? But again, we do have to take it a step further, and we want to compare that to the historical averages as well. And that's whether we want to gauge if the margins are tight or if they're, wide, which is better, right? So the wide margins will incentivize crushers to really push and increase their crush. And if they're pushing and increasing their crush because margins are there, what that means is they're going to have more demand on the input, in this case soybeans, but they're also going to be producing more of the output, right? Which is meal and oil. And again, just like the last one, when that situation, if you have wide margins, everyone's going to move in and try to maximize those margins to the point that it compresses it down to what would be the norm, right? Back to a market equilibrium on it. So whereas on the tight side, processors will slow down or they'll even halt. That's where it becomes bearish for the input, less demand on soybeans for crushing, and then that can also mean it bulls up the meal and the oil, right? If the demand is, relatively the same. And once again, what happens is the demand will push up the margin, and that'll help incentivize to increase the crush back up to maybe an equilibrium level again. So all these factors are independent, yet very dependent on each other and moving as one. So when we're looking at a commodity product spread, like the crush spread, and seeing, yes, $2 a bushel looks like it's pretty lucrative, we still have to dive in more to figure out a lot more about what that means in comparison to what we've seen and what that means for an incentive for a crusher to increase or decrease their crush rate, because that will then play into an effect on what their demand is going to be on soybeans or not, which in effect plays into what the price of soybean futures will be too. Inter-exchange spread. So an inter-exchange spread is comparing the same commodity across two different exchanges. Generally, these are global exchanges. If you think about it, in the US, you're not going to have really one corn exchange in one state and one corn exchange futures in the other. because there's just not enough liquidity, that there's really only one exchange that can exist for most, basically per country, if not in some cases for even a whole continent's production. Um, so what it's good is providing also signals about what's happening on international demand flows, right? And what global arbitrage opportunities. Again, we are producing commodities that are not just produced or traded in our own country, but that are produced and traded around the world, that it becomes a very international competitive market. And we need to be following market signals that can tell us what's happening in other places as well, and how that's going to impact the prices that we get in our country, right? So if we look at it, we want to be able to figure out how that global trade flow is happening at any time. And that's why looking at, if we look at, say, a canola, ICE canola against the Euronext canola, is going to let us know what the difference in prices is and how what kind of arbitrage can exist for international buyers and export slash import trade flows, right? So one of the things is, on if a commodity on an exchange is trading at a currency equivalent premium to exchange B, as we have, the traders will want to buy that cheaper exchange and sell the expensive one, right? So this buying and selling pressure, again, just like any spread, will move prices back to converge. So what it is capturing on arbitrage opportunities. But what those arbitrage opportunities can also mean is, if you are in the cheaper commodity, there's a chance people will be buying up that commodity. Once again, pushes up its price and demand, right? While on the other exchange or the other country, continent, is being sold off, right? So that's where you got to look at this on, once again, looking at them together and seeing how that's affecting the trade flows. The other key insight, or what we have here listed as a key insight, is the currency conversion when you're going through this. So given that these are different exchanges in different countries or continents, they may trade under a different unit, and they're more than likely trading under a different currency. So you have to make sure that when you are looking at inter-exchange spreads, that you are getting it down to the same per unit metric, and that you have it under the same currency, so you can be comparing apples to apples. So let's look at one here. Okay, so as I mentioned, you have to make sure that everything's converted to the same currency and same unit before actually comparing. And generally speaking, the USD is essentially the global standard for international commodity trade, so you are best converting everything to a USD basis. So as we have here, right, identify prices, note both exchange prices in local currency, convert over to the FX that you choose to use, and like I'm saying, the best is generally to convert over to USD. Ensure that you're using the same unit, that if you're looking at bushels in one exchange, that it's also bushels on the other. If it's metric tons in one, bushels in the other, make sure you're converting them to be the same. You can choose what that same unit is, but make sure it's the same unit that one of them is traded in, right? And then calculate the spread. So if you look down here, we've got an example on canola. So you have ICE canola in Canada that's traded on Canadian dollars per metric ton. You also have Euronext rapeseed that is traded in euros per metric ton as well. So we want to look at what that spread is on these same commodities, right, that are on different exchanges. This ICE canola is traded in North America, Euronext over in the EU. So we'll convert the CAD over to USD, and we'll convert the euro over to USD to figure out what that price, right? And then we subtract the difference, and we find that Euronext has a $42 USD per metric ton premium to ICE. So what this tells us is that Euronext rapeseed is more expensive than Canadian canola in the USD terms. So traders and end users will look to buy this cheaper Canadian canola and ship it to the EU market and sell against the higher Euronext price. Now, that premium also will have, or that spread I should say, will also have to exist to cover difference in shipping and all those added costs that the logistics side to actually get the product there. So this 42 might say, hey, yeah, that's plenty enough for someone to buy canola out of North America and ship it to the EU and make an arbitrage opportunity, right? And what would happen is that would get pushed all the way to the point where that spread narrows, that arbitrage opportunity disappears, right? And so that is, again, why we need to look at these, because it is going to be a signal for potentially higher or lower prices and higher or lower demand. If you're sitting and you're in North America, say in Canada, on canola, ice canola, and you are trading, let's just widen it out, $100 a ton less than Euronext rapeseed, there is a good chance, and logistics are only going to cost $50 to get it from Canada to the EU. There's a good chance that everyone from the EU is going to come and start buying up a bunch of Canadian canola, pushes the price up because it's pushing the demand up, ship it to the EU, sell it against the EU prices, which will push their price down, right, as their demand is reduced, right, to the point where that $100 premium spread on Euronext no longer exists. The arbitrage is gone, right? So these are signals to us about what's happening in that physical market. That's our introduction to spreads. As always, I'm Steven, and you can contact me at steven@simplehedge.com. You can give us a call at our US or Canada number. We appreciate all comments and feedback and having some great discussion. Also, if you're looking to dive into things a little bit more. And of course, always follow us on our socials on X and Instagram at our handles below. Thanks very much.